Our next item as part of this section is what Google announced on Global Accessibility Awareness Day. That was the 19th of May, so last Thursday from when we're recording. And there were quite a few interesting things in this. 2 or 3 announcements that certainly I was going to mention. Warren, shall we start with changes to the Play Store and the accessibility tag for different apps?
Given the fact that this was this week was that GAAD, Global Awareness, Global Accessibility Awareness Day that you mentioned earlier, Ed, it does make sense that we talk about this. And of course, Google wanting to do something for the Global Accessibility Awareness Day, announced these things, changes to the Play Store. If you're like me, there's sometimes when you go to the Play Store, you try to download an app and then you find out that app is not accessible and all of that. And it's something we've been talking about for quite a spell, wishing that Google would have badges to apps that are accessible so that when one goes to the Play Store, one knows which ones are compliant and which ones are not compliant when we talk about accessibility. And finally, to see that Google bringing that to the Play Store, and now we'll be able to see apps that have those tags of A11Y accessibility and or whatever. But then we have different categories of accessibility. If that particular app meets this accessibility, whether it's visual, whether it's dexterity, whether it's hearing and all of that. So you guys, are you excited about this? I'm excited about this, yet in the same breath, I'm kind of like, well, Google, that is great, but that does not enforce, accessibility, because I would rather want to see something that Google says, hey, everyone that is doing something or publishing their apps on the Play Store have to make it accessibility compliant. That's what maybe I'm a little too radical on that. But
no, it was exactly what I thought. And I know you can run compliance things to check whether your app's accessible. I just think that probably the running of that accessibility compliance tool should happen by default. Whether you fix the errors or not, I guess is your issue. But if to check whether your app is accessible is something you need to do, then you're probably not going to bother doing it. There'll be certain things that will never be accessible because of the sort of apps that they are. But yeah, I think they could get a bit more proactive. One thing I wasn't sure about with this was whose job it was to assign the tag. Does Google do it and kind of using AI, or does the developer do it?
Google would use AI to determine which ones are compliant and label those and give them those tags. And so it's a monumental job, but yet in the same breath, it's easy for Google because it would be looking for certain keywords to determine whether an app, meets such a criteria. So I think that it's a good start for Google. But like I said, frankly, I don't know who they're afraid of. Google, you are the king. You should sit up on that throne and say, hey, your app has to be accessibility compliant. We're not talking about, apps that we know are out of our range. I'm not going to ask someone for a sketching app to make it accessible for me, when it requires, drawing and whatever, or things like that. We're not stupid. We know what we can and what we cannot do. We know our limits. But I think we need to have basic accessibility in every app. I mean, even if it's not an app that I'm going to be able to use, at least to know that this button is for this and that. I'm giving an example here. There's this email app that I would love to see us play with. I signed up for it yesterday. It's called Skiff Mail, SKIFF mail. Is end-to-end encrypted email. And because I know some people have been having some problems with their, email messages, or, they want some other email client. And, this Skiff Mail is a prime example. There's absolutely no reason why the developer didn't make it compliant. I'm about to write them about it, and hopefully this is still in the early access, and maybe they would make it compliant. But so these are the type of things that I'm talking about. People doing things like this and uploading things to the Play Store without, ensuring that we have access to it. I think it's just wrong. Absolutely wrong.
It is, but a really good way to get people to change that if they care enough, or even if they don't care as much. If you just message them individually, you might just not get a reply and nobody cares because nobody else saw. But if you do a review on the App Store, on the Play Store, if you do a review on the Play Store saying it's not accessible, and then they still don't fix it, because that review is there for all to see, you might get more results, perhaps.
Actually, I actually found the exact opposites. I got completely, I was actually blasted, and then my comment was actually removed from the Play Store when I notified them through a review of an inaccessible app. So basically, the way I see it is, unfortunately, until every jurisdiction that Google is in has some level of accessibility legislation mandated, I don't know we're ever going to actually get to a point where every app that's realistic to be accessible will be. Because using Canada and the US as an example, the US has the accessibility legislation, where Canada, it only applies to the federal spaces. So if there's an application that's built in the US that's not accessible, you've got routes to go through legal channels if necessary, where here in Canada, you have absolutely no control. They don't have to make their applications accessible. So my thing would be, if Google implements a cross-platform accessibility requirements, it technically can't be enforced, which then would mean more applications would maintain their inaccessibility. And I do think we may have to start giving incentives to some of these app developers to make their apps accessible, because some of them they either don't have the understanding, or they just don't care enough to do a couple extra codes to make it accessible for those, especially with vision loss. But even then, some apps for video have no subtitles for those who are deaf. So again, is it a lack of education, a lack of caring? And is that something that Google themselves has a capacity to mandate without drastically losing applications being published to the Play Store and us seeing more and more third-party app stores popping up? Like, I don't know that there's going to be a good answer to this.
I think some of the compliance tools could be more proactive, couldn't they? And then whether a dev fixes it or not is kind of their thing. I mean, I don't mind third-party stores. I mean, that's sort of what Android's for, isn't it? You know, it's not iOS. You don't have to jailbreak your device and use Cydia, whether or not you choose to sideload apps. I know Warren doesn't. I do, because I don't view it any different to installing an app on Windows outside of the Microsoft Store. Obviously, you've got to be careful. I don't mind third-party stores on Android.
No,
but
I actually quite like it. But it's just going to be one of those things where we're then basically, we're already kind of open to the Wild West when it comes to apps. I think the legislation and mandates from Google, I don't know that there's a way to enforce it.
But I don't think that there doesn't need to be a legislation. Government doesn't even have a place here, because I'll give you an example and why I'm saying this. If you guys are familiar with Fairmail just got removed from the Play Store yesterday because Google claimed whatever, blah, 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 violated whatever, even though the guy explained it. So what I'm trying to say is that actually Google could implement this on its own. This is this is how we want apps to be on our Play Store. If you're going to publish your app on the Play Store, it has to meet XYZ criteria. And it's very simple. It doesn't mean that your app cannot be uploaded. So, you'll get a message say, hey, your app is failing in this. You need to correct this in order to have your app published on the Play Store. As simple can be, frankly. So to me, I think it's all Google. Google is the one that's given this leeway for this bad behavior that we're seeing from some of these developers.
Oh, well, I don't know. This happens on iOS as well. There are some apps.
I don't care about iOS. I'm talking about the one that I use.
Yeah, but you can't say it's just Google because that's not true.
Well, no, we can because we're talking about Android. Though.
I'm not talking about iOS. I don't care what
Android
iOS
podcast.
does.
Yeah, of course, but it's not factually correct to say it's only a problem on Google.
It is in the confines of the podcast episode, though, because we're not talking about iOS.
No, it is factually correct because it's the apps that I use and it's the App Store that I use. And all I'm saying is that, frankly, no government has anything in here. It's all dependent on Google. If Google says your app does not meet this accessibility requirement, you are not publishing it on the Play Store. It's simple.
So actually,
they're not going to do that, though, are they?
Actually, technically, Warren, government does have play, because if you look, I'm going to use probably a poor example, but it's one that's factual. If you look right now, Epic Games, the ones who've created Fortnite, they remove the ability to use Google or Apple stores for purchasing in-game money. That has created a legal lawsuit between Epic and Apple. So you start having companies or app developers being removed from the Play Store because of application and accessibility. You're actually opening the door for lawsuits, which then does bring the legislation into play.
I don't think that is something that is related to this. This has all to do with money thing, whatever payment systems. But frankly,
no, but the concept does apply.
I'm talking about language design of an app.
Yes, but it still applies.
No, let me explain.
You could sue someone in your country for not making it accessible. You could, and they might have to change their app.
In the US, you totally can.
I'm trying to say.
And here.
If I want to publish an app, for example, and if my app is not, let's say, forget about accessibility, for example, if someone publishes their app to the Play Store and does not have the buttons or whatever for people to know what they're clicking on, I'm telling you that Google would tell them, hey, your app is not operable. People can't figure out what is going on. If sighted people can see something and realize that this means this and that, why don't we have the same access to where we could know and distinguish as to what button does what? It's very simple. And if that's true, why did Google implement the accessibility scanner that is intended for developers to scan their whatever? Like I will say this again, and now people will agree with me. Google can enforce accessibility. Hey, it's part of our language development. If you're going to develop an app, we need to make it accessible to all. And there's no person on the face of the earth that will say, hey, you don't want to make your app accessible to people with disability. It's just wrong.
Yeah, but there are some things like, for example, a music app wouldn't be accessible to a deaf person, or a drawing app wouldn't be accessible to us. So
that.
You can't.
We've covered that. We've said there are certain ones that I'm not stupid. I'm not going to go out there and say, hey, I want a sketching app, to be accessible.
Yeah, but if Google said it has to be all apps, then they wouldn't be able to.
There are certain criteria, because there are certain apps that can be used by both sighted and blind people, or both hearing people with hearing loss and people with hearing that they can use. For example,
you'd have to specify what apps have to be accessible or something. You'd have to have certain categories where where I don't know how
and
you
they're
do
already
that.
into categories out there. Google has the categories of apps. And so if your app falls in the general category of apps or whatever, you need to make it accessible. We're not talking about specialized apps. Specialized apps that I cannot use, for example, or, maybe like, I want to use something like a shooting, targeting, or whatever stuff, and I'm not able to do that or whatever. I'm not asking for that. I'm just asking for, like the one I just gave an example about, the skiff mail that I'm talking about. You absolutely don't need to have a special whatever. It's not a specialized app. It's just a simple email client. Why under heaven is this app not accessible and yet be allowed on the Play Store? That's my beef.
I think that one of the problems is because some of these app developers start off quite small, and there are a surprising, well, maybe it's not so surprising, there's a huge number of people who don't even know that blind people can use a smartphone at all. And if you're one of those people, and, how can you know what you don't know?
But that's what Google I/O is all about. Google I/O is for developers. Okay, and everybody.
Yeah, but you might not know it's a thing you have to check if you have never heard of it.
You're missing my point. That's what I'm saying. If you're uploading an app, there should be a mechanism on the Play Store that will tell you, hey, your app is falling short because of the category of your app. Your app is the tab that is supposed to be used by all, but it's not meeting XYZ criteria.
So
and it will take you to the guidelines where you can find how to make that accessible.
Yeah, they should do that. What was wrong with the app? Were the buttons not labeled?
It's just not labeled.
That's rubbish.
That's the problem. And so, frankly, if you look at what I'm saying, actually, it will be helpful to the developers. It makes everybody aware of the fact that the world doesn't revolve around them. We have other people out there and all of that. But Google needs to step to the forefront. Just trying to tag this one as being accessible or this one not being accessible, to me, it falls short.
Yeah, maybe they need to phrase it differently and say you must have text labels for your buttons, and then explain why. Because if you say to a lot of sighted people, this app isn't accessible, they'll say, I don't know what you mean. I don't understand.
No, they don't.
So it is about education as well, I think. And Google have got lots of money. They can educate people. They can afford it.
Yeah, and they don't need to go out there trying to educate. Like I said, you try to upload an app, then that thing will automatically kick in and just tells you, hey, you're missing something here because of the category that your app falls into. It's supposed to have this and this such and such labels, but right now it fails, and here's how you can fix that. It's very simple. Very simple.
If they're not going to do that, and it looks like they're not, I think we've got to be realistic about this. If they're not going to do that, these accessibility labels could be useful in terms of if I need to find an app for something and I need to do it relatively quickly, and it says it's accessible, as long as the AI works properly, that's the only thing I'm a bit worried about if it is AI labeling it and not a person. It could save me time. For example, if I wanted... I've been writing a sermon. If I wanted a Bible app, there's probably quite a lot of them. And if I can make it so that the accessible ones show up first, or it only filters out the accessible ones or something, that would save me a heck of a lot of time. So it could be a good thing. But I agree that apps that don't have labeled buttons, it's not good, and they shouldn't. They should be made to label them. But I don't think that's going to happen at the moment.
I think inevitably it'll generate probably not false positives, but you'll get a lot of false negatives, won't you? Like plenty of apps that are at least usable won't be tagged, I would imagine. Yeah. Maybe it'll be a less of a problem that inaccessible apps will be tagged as accessible, but I think a lot of apps that are perfectly usable won't be tagged. That would be my inkling as to where this will go.
Have they said it's going to be AI? deciding this stuff.
It is AI. Yeah,
They've said that.
We'll
Okay.
link that, the page to our show notes in there. But it's funny, Fee, you mentioned the Bible app. So there's a Bible app that I really, really like, and that's called Logos. Logos, and that app, for whatever reason, is not accessible at all. And so, as coincidence would happen, I ran into this guy at church, I think about a couple of years ago, and he was going to work for Logos. They're right here in my backyard in Bellingham area in the state of Washington. And I'm like, hey, tell them, this blind kid here is asking them to make that app accessible. It's not accessible. And, so he went, and unfortunately he didn't get the job, if something happened or whatever. You think that people from organizations like this, religious organizations and things like that, would even be more in tune to the fact that, you have other people, you're trying to reach people of all sorts and stuff like that, and make their stuff accessible, especially to blind people who cannot read a written thing on the paper. But you now have something here in electronic version, make it accessible to them. But you think they would do that? No, they didn't. So, and I tried to call them. Oh yeah, someone is gonna help. Someone's gonna call you about it. Did I hear anyone back? I just gave up on them. But maybe I shouldn't. So things of this nature, that's why I'm saying the answer lies with Google. If Google would just create a simple thing that does a quick check upon trying to upload and just shows you, hey, you're missing XYZ here, I think it's going to help everybody.
I think it's interesting what you say about that app, though, because I think a lot of sighted people think that they don't realize about things like TalkBack. So they think, oh, we can't do this accessibility because we haven't got time to make it into an audio Bible, because they don't realize that that's not necessary. So I think we maybe need to request things more specifically and say, I can't use your app because you haven't labeled the buttons, for example. I think that if they realize that all you want is for them to label the buttons, they might go, oh, actually, that'd be really easy to change. Whereas if you're not very specific, and I don't know what you said, but if one generally is not very specific and just says, your app's inaccessible, most people are going to, I don't know what that means. I don't know how blind people do things. I've got too many things to do. And so yours will fall down the back of the drawer because it's too complicated looking. So I think we need to help these companies a bit by being more specific sometimes with our requests.
If there's anyone that is always very clear when I try to report something to a developer, it has to be me. I go through the process and explain it to them. And then I also send them pages and send them, little video clips of me trying to show them what the app is doing that is not following accessibility guidelines and things like that. There's one called Bubble Up. I've been meaning to show it on our podcast, but Bubble Up is not very accessible. And I talked to the guys, and I send them a video clip about it. They said they're going to look into it. But so I'm one of those that usually will send a video clip and explaining to them, and also sending them to Google pages to further explain what I'm talking about. But it's important, you're right. If you're going to send a report to a developer, make sure you know exactly what you're talking about so that they're not confused. They're not thinking you want them to create an audio version. That's not what we're talking about, and show them exactly what that is. And sometimes it doesn't even hurt to show them, hey, if you bring up your accessibility or bring up TalkBack, you'll see what I'm talking about, or here's such and such an app, and here's how it works. And if you look at this app, it has all those correct labels, and yours does not. But if there's anything, like I said, try to show them a little video clip of it if you are able to. But if not, give them those help pages. It always comes in very handy.
Help pages might be good. I don't know about videos. If it's literally that someone hasn't labeled their buttons, they're just graphics, I would just say, at the moment, this phone is just saying button, button, button. I don't know what any of these do. Please add text labels. And unless they ask me to, I wouldn't bother sending a video, because, again, if you're a busy developer, the video might just be too much of an attachment you haven't got time to open. So it depends on the developer, I think, and how much time they've got and how big the company is.
You can never know that, though. You can't
No.
know how much time an individual developer has, and the screen recording will show them what's going on.
Yeah, and
It's
actually,
true. It's true,
a lot
but-
of them like to see that because they want to
Do
see
they?
what they are
Yeah.
talking about. Yes, remember, sighted people are all about visuals, and
Yeah,
you know, when
that's
you
true.
touch a thing, they know what I'm touching, and I said, okay, like this one here, I don't know what this button does, and they know exactly what you're talking about. And
Yeah.
I tell you, the videos are very crucial. A lot of people that I ask about labeling things, they will say, hey, if you could send us screenshots or videos or whatever. They like that because then it saves them time knowing what area you're talking about that is not accessible.
That's good to know. I appreciate you saying that, because that's good for me to know if I need to report something, because I could use one of those screen recording apps that you've talked about before, you know, and send them. But I'd say because if it's something as simple as the buttons aren't labeled, which, you know, it's not simple, it's really annoying, but it's simple probably in terms of programming, I would try and keep my video quite short.
Oh no, well, no one is going to keep a video long, but you know, see, sometimes the the language that I use, maybe I say, hey, your buttons are not labeled, and maybe he doesn't call them buttons, he may call them controls or whatever, and he may not know what I'm talking about, but if I show him in a video, he knows exactly what I'm talking about. That thing is not giving me a feedback when it engages my screen reader.
Yeah, and I mean, some apps it's worse because it doesn't even tell you when you're on a control with some of them. And they're the worst ones. You know, where you touch the screen and nothing, as far as we're concerned, nothing happens. That's very annoying.
So Google, if you're hearing the BAU, Blind Android Users Crew, you know, you guys need to do more. I love you guys, to death. But frankly, I'm glad we have this. But like, Ed says, there may be some false positive or whatever, because some nice app may be missed by the AI and all of that. I think that the most important thing is that Google already have a tool there, the accessibility checker, integrate that into their development kit, the Android Studio or whatever, so that when you are developing and that app falls in that category that is for everybody, it will let you know you are missing XYZ. I think that's my contention.
Maybe with the AI, they're doing it as a sort of, I mean, I don't know what Google's going to do next. Nobody does apart from them. But I wonder if they want to see how well this works with the AI first before they try and enforce anything else. Because if the AI isn't actually as reliable as they hope, flagging things as inaccessible when they're not, for example, that could be a problem. So maybe this is a bit of a trial. I don't know. It'd be interesting to see what happens next.
There's no suggestion it's a trial, I don't think. I think they are...
No, I don't mean a trial as in a beta, but I mean a trial as in maybe they're seeing how well it goes down with users. Do you know what I mean? To see how reflective it is of reality and whether there are... I mean, I hope there are going to be ways where we, for example, can say to Google, actually, this app's really accessible. Can you add it to your list of ones that is? Or is it all going to be down to Google? It'd be a shame if it was all down to Google, because otherwise, like we've been saying, things might get missed that are actually really good.
That's a good idea, Fee, because that's the very thing Ed was afraid of, because maybe something could be missed. An app that is otherwise accessible could be missed. And so if there's a place on the Play Store there that, we could, manually say, add it to the list of whatever accessible apps, I think that's also a nice idea.
I think someone would have to check them, because obviously a developer could just log in with a different account and go, add my app to your accessibility thing, just to make them look good. So I think Google would have to check it. But yeah, I think being able to suggest new apps would be good, or maybe they'd have to have so many reviews that said it was accessible or something like that.
Google relies too much on AI, and so I'm hoping that this AI would be able to flag apps that are good, label, tag those apps that are good to us as blind people, or people with hearing loss, or people with dexterity issues, because that's what we're talking about. And like you said, we'll see what happens. It's right now only a handful of apps, and especially example, Google Accessibility Suite is one of those. But so we'll give this thing maybe to the end of the month. I think we should to the end of the month, the end of the year rather. We'll come back, touch on this again sometime toward the end of this year and see where we are so far with this tagging of apps. But again, I always go back to my default. Google needs to just have something in place that would remind people that their app is not meeting accessibility requirements.